Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to today's Geary seminar. Before we start, the usual reminder about phones to silent. Beware of your desktop. This seminar is being recorded, and so I've been asked to mention that if you have questions, points of clarification, please feel free to ask them during the seminar, but any more substantive points for discussion, if you can leave them towards the end, that would help with the recording. Our speaker today is Eric Strobl, who is here on BICS Fellowship as the guest of Frank Walsh from School of Economics. And just a reminder that this year's new round of BICS funding is open. There's information on the newsletter which went around today, so please have a look at that. We'd encourage everybody to apply. So today we're delighted to welcome back to UCD Eric Strobl, who's going to be talking about bugged out adaptation to the 1874 Rocky Mountain locust plague. So without further ado, Eric, over to you.
Okay, so first of all, thanks very much for the invite. So this is a paper jointly with Luisito and his PhD student Aurélie at the University of Luxembourg. Just for those of you who don't know the geography that well, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is the Great Plains, which is kind of this area that cuts across 10 different states but doesn't contain any of them holding it. So a bit of background. So this sort of area, the Great Plains, before sort of the mid of the 19th century, it was kind of always referred to, or very often, as the Great American Desert. Kind of this land that was uninhabitable, that was kind of, run by native Indian, sometimes very aggressive tribes, that there's only really populated by fur traders and these sort of things. Now, starting in 1861, after the 11 of the slave states left the Union, the Republicans, the congressional Republicans, started pushing to try to settle this area, right? In part to try to prevent the slave states from doing the same sort of thing. And what they essentially did is they introduced, and I'll talk a little more detail what they are, a few key pieces of legislation that really tried to encourage settlement of the Great Plains. I mean, the one you may know is the Homestead Act here. Now, the thing is that the Great Plains, and that was part of why it was considered the Great American Desert, was kind of very different for cultivation than what people would have been used to in the other areas of the US, and also, as you see later, settlers coming from Europe, right? And I'll talk about that later as well. And it was very susceptible to environmental shocks, particular climate shocks, but also something like what we have here is the locust plague. And essentially in 1874, the Rocky Mountain locust plague had this large invasion of the Great Plains. I mean, people have tried to do estimates even back then of what it might have been, and they kind of think it was roughly about 1.5 trillion insects covering about 500 square kilometers, and that's roughly the size of California, right? That size. So you can think it was a really, really large shock in this regard, and they migrated into this area. So there's no pictures, no photographs at the time of what it looked like. They had some for a little bit later, but it's not very impressive. But you have a lot of narrative sources that talk about this large black cloud that appeared in the sky, and then, the scourge of the prairies there were upon us. So I'm just picking a few of them. And probably the most important thing, it wasn't just that it was this really large phenomena that settlers wouldn't have been used to, but also that it caused a lot of damage, right? And these locusts, as I'll talk about later, they essentially eat any sort of vegetation, and they essentially just land eat everything, right? Essentially all the crops during this period. And this was exactly near the harvesting season here. It would also eat a lot of people's clothes, parts of it, and parts of the fence posts, anything that was essentially at some point vegetation here. So it's hard to get figures on the damages, but they did do this report afterwards that I'll talk about later, and they've kind of tried to estimate, and they even themselves claim that it was a lower estimate, that it was about $200 million US, so that'd be about 5 billion today. If you compare it to those states that were affected, it would have been about, over the 2 years, about 36%, so a little bit over a third of the agricultural output. And that was just the direct effect from this year. So the question, of course, one can ask oneself is, how did the local population react to such a large environmental shock, right? It was just the early part of the settlement and these sort of things. And I was kind of surprised that there was no empirical study to date, because I did part of my schooling in the US, and even I remember hearing about it. I don't know if I heard about it in history class or some documentary I watched or something. But when I looked, I mean, there's lots of discursive things that talk about it. You have lots of times local newspapers that kind of bring it up, the event again. So it's part of this sort of rural, urban folklore within that area there, but you don't have anybody that really looked at it more quantitatively here. And so what we do in this paper, we wanted to really look at how did the local population adapt at first in terms of migration, and then in terms of those people that potentially didn't migrate if they change their agricultural practices. And I'll talk about that later. Now there is kind of in the historical literature among economists more and more interest in large environmental shocks, not just as a natural experiment, because it tended to be very important in a lot of cases. So I'm just going to talk about within the United States here. So there are the famous ones about the Dust Bowl, right, which was really about the Great Drought in the 1930s, that have looked at both migration and the agricultural impact, and you found things like value of agricultural land went down in the areas that were eroded, migration increased, but there was negative selection. There was a lot of non-farmers rather than farmers that migrated. There's also two studies that looked at the boll weevil, which was this kind of bug that destroyed cotton plants, the flowers and the buds in this regard, and they also find that it caused some people to migrate and some impacts on agriculture here, and that some of the farms diversified away from it. Then there's the Mississippi flood that looked at flood migration, particularly the Black American versus white American. Now these are all in the 19th century here. So I think the Rocky Mountain plague, rather than, or not just being another big environmental shock, has some interesting aspects to it that I think one can learn from. First of all is the early settlement of the Great Plains, and as I'll be talking about later, these were settlers that had no experience with this sort of agriculture. The shock was largely unanticipated because there hadn't been any locust invasion for a few years. So even the few people that had already been there wouldn't have known anything about it. There was no preventive methods either in terms of trying to kill the locusts. There were just too many. And even once they laid their eggs, even though they certainly tried in this regard. And then finally, there was just no public relief, which really, during the Dust Bowl, played a big role and had long-term implications here. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So it's a very different context. I think it's sort of a context, I mean, also, it's before that sort of kind of mass migration in the end of the 19th century, but it's a sort of a context where you really have kind of this large environmental shock and not a lot of government intervention and not much anticipation of it either. Right? Hardly any. Okay, so these are the Great Plains, so you can see it again, and it's a very special area in the US, and you might remember this if you watch the old Westerns, where you have all the wagon trails going through, and they kind of try to get through it as quickly as possible so they don't get attacked by Indians, but it's kind of treeless, and you can see that's a real problem for that sort of farm technology was there. So you didn't have wood to build the huts, and they would build these mud houses there. You couldn't build fences. So this is before the big kind of rise of cattle in the United States here. It's a semi-arid region that sometimes you could have a lot of rainfall, sometimes very little here. It was a relatively uniform vegetation and flat terrain. And prior to the 1860 or so, there was general sort of this perception that it wasn't very suited for agriculture, but they started realizing that actually the soil is nutritionally very rich, but it was difficult to crop, right? At least with the technology that was available. So it was very, very hard work here. And a relatively volatile climate, right? As I was saying. So that's the background here. So how about the expansion of the US territory? So there was, of course, the Louisiana Purchase, which, essentially nearly doubled the size of the United States at the time here. There was the annexation of Texas, and then there was the Kansas-Nebraska Act that essentially some lands were declared federal. So as I said before, even though it substantially expanded, well, certainly by 1860 here, it was not really considered suitable for cultivation, so there was not really much talk about settling in there. It was considered a hostile territory, right, in the sense you just had fur traders if you're trying to pass through it. So if you know all the history about the Oregon Trail, people going to the western coast, it was kind of, you wanted to get through that area as quickly as possible here. And in part also because there was semi-hostile Native Indian American tribes, although one wonders how much of that is more story than anything else. So what the government then did is, and in part I think if you read some of the narratives, it was sort of strategic against these breakaway slave states here, but in general they also wanted to increase the sort of base for agricultural production of the United States here. They introduced probably what is most best known as the Homestead Act here, right? The Homestead Act essentially, you were allowed to buy certain federal lands, predetermined ones for relatively cheap. Well, first of all, you had to buy a license, which for 100, they were all 160 acres of it, so that's roughly, I think, 0.6 square kilometers, a really large size. You could buy it for $16 US, which is roughly about 600 US now. And then you had to stay on there or show that you stayed on there at least for 5 years, and then you could buy it at $1.25 per acre. So that would be, for that amount of land, roughly about 7,000. Now this sounds all good, but of course it had some drawbacks. You weren't allowed to take out a mortgage on your land, right? And a lot of people that came in didn't have a lot of financial money. So a lot of people that came from Europe and these sort of things, but also within the US here. So it's not as attractive as it sounds here. You had the Moral Land Grant Act that essentially gave each state federal land, depending how many representatives they had at Congress and senators, I think 30,000, and they could then sell that private land, right, as long as they would then invest the money in building these agricultural colleges. So that's why you have in these sort of big states, you have things like Ohio State and all these things that have these big agricultural units in that regard here. And I think that's the most important one is the Pacific Railways Act here, because one of the problems is that in the Great Plains you do have rivers, but they're not navigable because sometimes they become dry. So they really decided that they wanted to create this kind of railway across them because it could then create a way of, first of all, exporting foods into the two coasts, into the cities, and secondly also bringing in imports in this regard. And essentially what they did is they sold, sometimes gave away large amounts of land to the railways. And what the railways would do, they would first of all buy out the land where they wanted to put the railway. And then of course they were very smart about it. They started also buying up land that was very near it, right? Because they realized if we want to make more profit in the future, if we can build towns where everything is around them, then essentially we're going to make a lot of money in this regard. So, and this is actually, even though everybody thinks, or a lot of people think about the Homestead Act as being the most important thing, it's really the Railways Act here, because it was much more attractive. And if you look at the amount of federal land that was allocated, I think it was about 500 million acres. No, some of it well after our period as well, but 500 million acres. Only about 80 was really allocated to Homestead Act here. And then you finally have, this was a little bit later, the Timber Culture Act that allowed people to buy additional land, 160 if you had to plant some amount of woods and timber on it, right? Because there was a shortage of that. That was the idea behind it. The thing I want to point out again, actually this shouldn't have been in this part, is that the agricultural technology back then was rudimentary, right? So you only had really two important agricultural innovations here. There was this, the steel plow and the reaper, and they kind of worked together because part of that ground and part of what made it very hard to cultivate, at least the very first time, is that the ground was very hard. So it was really, really relatively hard work. And sometimes you had to do it 2 or 3 times. And this made it a little bit easier. This was in the 60s, but that was about it really. Right? There was no irrigation, there's no wood and these sort of things. Feel free to interrupt me, by the way. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what the period is here, so this is 1860, so we're not going to be looking at that. We're going to look at from 1870 to 1880. Well, the plague was in 1874 here. So as you can see here, you have population to left and right. And this is sort of the frontier we're talking about. And essentially by building the railways, encouraging settlement, kind of narrowed that frontier until, I guess it's around 1890 when Turner talked about that frontier movement was over here. And so our starting point in terms of some of the data, or the data that we have is, this was the very first railway they built. You can see there was very few people living in there. They had some extension of this railway. And then our end point of where we're going to look at the data is when they started expanding it. But it's well before that period where they really invested into these railways and a lot of people moved into there. Okay, so the Rocky Mountain locust, there's no picture because it became extinct at the end of the 19th century. A lot of people think because its breeding grounds is near the Rocky Mountains, some area around there, that became settled and just destroyed their breeding grounds. They have tried to or they have been able to recreate the DNA because people have found in Minnesota some old specimens of these here. But I think the main thing is that the natural breeding grounds, and I'll show you a picture, or believed at the time, because you can't really prove it anymore, is an area around the Rocky Mountains, a relatively large one. Importantly about their population dynamics is they generally kind of all lived in that area near the natural breeding grounds, but sometimes if the weather conditions were right, the population would really explode here. In particular, what was believed at the time, from what they were looking at, if there was a period of rain followed by some sort of long drought afterwards, and that just seemed to be ideal, then population would get much larger than what the natural breeding grounds could hold here. They're omnivorous, that is, they eat any sort of vegetation or practically any sort of thing. But if, let's say, the population is too large relative to the breeding ground or some other reason, if there's a shortage of food, then they tend to migrate, at least temporarily, in whichever direction, left to the right of what it is here. And this is mostly driven by the wind. I mean, they can fly compared to like grasshoppers don't really fly, but they're not very efficient at flying, so where they move is driven by the wind. And you'll see that a little bit, that helps us when we try to do something in terms of an instrument here. And they became extinct in the 19th century. There's still some discussion about what it was. But okay, so what about the invasion that we're talking about, or that one? So that was essentially in 1874. There were ideal breeding conditions during that time, but there was a shortage of food in that area around the Rocky Mountains here. And so then when they started hatching there and grew up to adults, they started migrating, being pushed by these easterly winds across the Great Plains in June and July here. And that's where that big, huge swarm kind of started forming and then moved across the plain here. As I said, it was, with these very rough estimates, a very, very large swarm size, something that certainly people have known before. Now, once they usually landed to feast on crops here, or wherever they landed, they also hatched their eggs here. So even after 74, there was some damage because these hatchlings would hatch and then start eating whatever was there in the crops. So that happened a little bit in the spring of 75. In 1876 and 1877, there was further small invasions from these hatchlings. But one of the things that people have pointed out that very likely these locust population didn't really thrive outside of their natural breeding grounds. So when you look at historical narratives, so there's a large report done by some entomologists at the time, it just seemed that if they would migrate into other areas, they wouldn't last very long. And so there's some people that talk about by 1877, there were still some locusts, but they called them harmless right here. Now, as I said, there was no preventive methods at the time, certainly to repel the insects. I mean, you just had millions of them, even though they tried. And what they did was some effort to try to destroy the eggs, some efficiently. So, but none of it really worked here. So they would try to things like drowning the fields. They would put sheets over them. They even built sort of a rudimentary flamethrower to try to burn them all. And they had this machine called the hopper that was also kind of throwing out flames and doing it, but nothing really worked. The government, I think some local governments offered money if you could come in with buckets full of the hatchlings, but it just didn't work. And then it just disappeared after that. Now, importantly, there was no relief at the time. So in terms of government at the county level, they didn't really see that as a job. Most of them were strapped in terms of their budget, right? At the state level, it wasn't clear what kind of responsibilities the state had. And at the government level, at the federal level, even though Congress, according to legislation, had essentially to enact legislation to ensure the social welfare of the United States here, it wasn't clear whether natural disasters kind of fell within that, right? And if you actually look at how much relief measures were passed by Congress over the 19th century, there were overall of 30, most of which were actually for foreign natural disasters here. 23 of them were after the locust plague here, so there just was no sort of role to play. Now, there was a little bit of relief near the end of it, so they, I think in the end, the government finally provided 150,000 US, which is, I forget, it's just a few million compared to the amount of people that were most likely affected. It was just very little. And even that was just in terms of food. Some of the states sometimes provided a little bit free kind of seeds for planting, but that was also limited. And I think at some stage the army, when the winter came after, it provided some clothes that ever they had here, but there clearly wasn't. One also has to remember at the time, it was still kind of this idea that you don't want to be giving poor people money, right? It's just going to make them dependent. It was also an interesting area in the US because prior to, let's say, mid of 18th century, farmers were kind of used as the backbone of the American economy, right? But then with kind of the rise of capitalists here, it was kind of farmers started being viewed as well, kind of backwards and rednecks and that. So it's a little bit of that, so there wasn't that there. Now, how about private relief? Because you do find some things like in the Chicago fire, yeah, was it the Boston fire? I don't know. There was some private relief, so you had these organizations, but they tended to be just focused on urban areas and they just wouldn't have had the means to do anything on that sort of scale here. So generally there was just no relief, right? There was, in terms of the Homestead Act, they did offer, because maybe you had to stay 5 years on your land, they did offer an extension so you could leave your land for a few months, but out of all the homesteaders, and there was at that stage there were already thousands and thousands, only 100 took it up, right? Because it's only 4 months, I think. They implemented it in December and you could leave your land to the following June or something when next cropping season was. Or maybe people just left and then came back anyway. Okay, So what about adaptation? Now here it's a little bit hard because you're just looking at narrative sources. You find lots of talk about what people did. So there's a book called Harvest of Grief. There's another one called Everything But the Fence Post. And then you have lots of local newspaper articles, particularly X-Post, talking about it. So there are, some of them mentioned that in some counties there was large migration, a lot of people left, right? Whereas in other ones they talk about, well, many settlers would have liked to have left, but they just didn't have money. Remember, migration is costly, and then where are you going to go and what are you going to do, right? And a lot of these were also Europeans that came in, right? Because these railway companies, I mean, they really put a lot of effort in trying to get people in because they were thinking medium term, long term, we can make a lot of money. So they actually had advertising in Europe, talking about, land is essentially practically free in the United States, targeting particularly Eastern and Western European countries, and you had a lot of people coming in there. Did it discourage settlers to come? Most likely not as much as one would expect, in part because even though states and counties didn't really provide relief, they were very concerned about that if this came out into the national news, that then people would be discouraged to come, and they really wanted people to come and invest into their local economies, right? So there's explicit things where they tried to downplay it. Some letters sent to newspapers where they told editors, don't say it is as serious as it is, and these sort of things. So probably not here. In terms of agricultural practices, again, you find different stories. Some talk about that there was some diversification, maybe a little bit towards livestock over crops that they thought was less susceptible, even though that's not so clear. And others say, well, they did diversify, but then 3 or 4 years later, they went back to what they were doing, right? And depending on the area. So something like wheat was the big cash value crop, right? That where you're sending food to the cities here, they just went back to it here. There was some switch to livestock they talk about, but remember this was before you had wire fencing. So the barbed wire fencing was really starting in the 1880s after that. And so there was no wood, so they couldn't really put up fences. So it just wasn't really worthwhile for farmers to have their own livestock there, but there was some of it. But we'll try to test this as much as one can with the data. Okay, so we are essentially going to be using 4 main data sources. First is about these historical maps. I'll talk about it when I show it to you in a second. And they were essentially done. There's what people kind of claim is the first entomologist. I keep on saying epidemiologist, but it's entomologist. He really, because there was a lot of concern at the government because they really wanted people to settle there. Well, we have this invasion. If that's going to happen and again, we need to study these species and find out what people can do about it. When is there going to be likelihood that you're going to have more of these invasions? How do they move and these sort of things? So they created this very, very long report where, first of all, they talk about the biology of it. They studied it for, I think it was, the first report was in 77 they did, so a few years after this. And then they also contacted all the counties and states and asked them, did the locusts arrive here or not? Were there any damages? And you get very different accounts in this regard here. The other thing we're using is the linked individual level census data between 1870 and 1880. So that's why I'm talking about medium term, well, maybe more short term, depending really. A growth economist or not. And here we want to look at migration, where we look at the change of county residents. And we look at males between 15 and 65, where we could match 760,000. So why do we just look at 1870 to 1880? I mean, one thing is if you start looking from, particularly with working age males from 1870 to 1890, you really start having a lot less observations. Secondly, of course, I mean, I was particularly concerned that in the 1880s, you had a lot of changes in that area, right? And even by the 90s, because you started having cattle ranching became a big thing with the barbed wire. Then they started discovering dry farming, which did very well with Great Plains, but then of course you had problems like you did with the Dust Bowl here, so we just kind of kept it at that here. But I really don't think there's much of a long-term shock, but it'd be hard to tease out even if there was. And finally, we use this reanalysis weather data from NOAA, which kind of, using local weather station data and some climate models, you can get all kinds of weather variables, right? But it's modeled. Although I was speaking recently to somebody in the Oeschger Center of Climate Change in Bern of how good it was, and he said he's surprised how good it is compared to events that you know of. But he wasn't talking about the US, he was talking about some other country. Okay, so let me talk about this locust invasion map. So this is the map that was created in the Riley report. And at first when we saw this, we were quite excited because kind of the yellow areas, so this is all the area that is affected. Yellow areas, what is called is overrun. Then you have kind of this where they talk about less affected area, that's the red, and the green is the most affected. The problem is when you start reading the report, it's never clear what you mean by overrun. And if you actually look at the reports from counties, these were affected as well. And when you start talking about the difference between the green and yellow, it's not really that more locusts arrived, it's just these counties tended to have more information about whether they were affected more in terms of the impact on agriculture and these sort of things. So, and of course the instrument we're creating, it's only one variable here. So we're just going to use the whole of this. So the real question is, if this is kind of our treatment group, what can we use as our control group? So one of the things is when they're studying, started in that report when they're studying about these locusts, they wanted to first of all know where the natural breeding grounds were. So they thought it was roughly around here from the information they had. And then from looking from previous locust invasions, and there were relatively few, so in the few years prior to, maybe the last 10 years prior to 1874, there was one or two very small ones, I think one in Minnesota and somewhere else. So, but they tried to look at any sort of newspapers, anything they had to try to figure out how far they would go. And essentially you can see it goes, first of all, both to the left and the right of the Rocky Mountains, which is around here. So both into the Great Plains and towards the western side of it, and also well beyond the Great Plains in this regard. And usually, at least the argument was it's driven by wind. So essentially with this in mind, what we did, and we messed around with, with a few things here, we essentially used this here as our treatment group. So this is that area, remember, that was affected, all of those. So any county that was intersected by that georeference map. And then we used all the counties that are within 300 kilometers of the affected area, right? We played a little bit around with going to 500, but you just get larger and larger things. So that's our treatment and control group. So we have 254 counties, 367. Now, if you can count very quickly, you'll see it's less than what's in here. But that's because some of them you had essentially maybe just either none or just a few linked data, right? And you know, there's parts of it, one of the things like Oklahoma here, that was only really declared available for settlement until sometime in the 1880s, even though there were early settlers there. So we have some missing counties here. I don't have a graph of it here for the moment because I couldn't find it. Okay, so this is just the characteristics. So what we tried to do, first of all, is this is from the individual level data. So this is between the affected and non-affected counties. Of course, if you have something like 700,000 plus observations, you're always going to get, or at least most of them being statistically different. But if you actually look at the difference, you know, in terms of the age, a little bit less than the year, and all those, there's really not so much difference in these personal characteristics here. But certainly you'd want to control for them. Now, if you actually look at the characteristics that we essentially took from the agricultural census, right, which is going to be our second data set we used. So these are all the variables that are there. And then we constructed variables in terms of the climate. There's also wind here that we don't put here. We put whether it was within the Rocky Mountain range, ruggedness, and the suitability indices from the FAO GAZ, as problematic as they are. Here you do see a little bit more differences in terms of both the statistical test and large of it. And in particular, if you look at for something like number of farms, it's much larger in the non-affected counties. And that's because they were no longer part of the frontier. What we do with at some stage with regressions, we try to use propensity score matching to reduce our sample of counties close. Oh, yes. Okay, so let me talk about regression. So we just start off, first of all, with an OLS, and then I'll talk about the instrument, so a linear probability model. Our dependent variable is whether an individual migrated between 1870 and 1880. So of course, we're a few years before the plague and a few years after, so we're not going to know about return migration in that regard. We're going to have some people that migrated maybe before the Rocky Mountain plague, right? But that's always a problem if you're using these 10 years migration. The only thing you'd be worried about if that's somehow correlated with whether an area is affected or not. I think the pre-migration, pre-event migration, not return migration, we just can't say anything about here. And we put in the vector of individual and all these county controls, agricultural, climatic, and geographic here to control for. And I'll show you the regression in a second. Now the main thing is because this is individual level data, we don't know if the individual is affected. So this is going to capture the average county effect of the locust plague here. Okay, so going to results here. So here I'm just going to show you the OLS. You know, including controls make some difference here, sometimes going up, sometimes down. But let's just look at column 4 here. So you see This is 0.5, so in linear probabilities, it increases the probability of about 5% here. And I'll talk a little bit later in a second when I talk about the IV, is that a lot or a little compared to other events here. Okay, so what are we worried about here? I think there's two things you'd be worried about omitted variables, right? I think particularly geographic variables, right? But could also be individual variables because these early census had even less information than the other ones. But I think even more worrisome is that kind of measurement error, right? So the way they created these maps, if you read the thing, is they looked at which counties, they contacted all the counties, and then they tried to create it around it. But there's going to be measurement error. First of all, maybe some are misclassified. Some we has it partially affected, but we include them as affected. We try to mess around with it. And then, of course, we don't have a real indication of which counties were more affected than the others in terms of being exposed to locusts, right? We just don't have that. In that map, as I was saying before, we started using that, but I just wouldn't believe it, so kind of left that out. Okay, so what can we think of instrumental variable? One of the main things, and this is in the report, all of it, is that these locust invasion, where they were moved to, was largely driven by wind. So part of the reason that sometimes they were going to the west is sometimes there was a westerly wind, a very strong, or some easterly, and how fast they moved just depended on the wind. And you can hear local accounts where farmers are essentially saying there was a sudden wind that came and suddenly all the locusts arrived here because, as I said, they weren't efficient flyers. So essentially what we do is we take that reanalysis data, we calculate in each county the average direction of the wind, and we take anything that was eastward, because that's what they talked about, that pushed them eastward here, and we calculate out the wind strength here, and then we base an instrument if a county on average had easterly moving winds and multiply it by the wind speed, right? And that's essentially the instrument that we're going to use for it. So that should capture at least the exogenous variation due to the climate of the locusts here. Okay, so this is the final column here where you can see essentially this is our instrument here. So it's one instrument. You know, the F-stat looks relatively good. It's certainly relevant, so it predicts it well. I was a little bit surprised because we just have that 0-1 dummy, but it seems to predict it very well here. But I think most importantly then, if you look at it, what you happen here is that the coefficient gets much larger, right? And that could be omitted variable bias, but I really think it's mostly measurement error if you believe our instrument. So that would imply that essentially living in a county that was affected, you have close to 11% greater linear probability of moving. Now, is this a lot or very little? I mean, it's difficult to compare it to the only other study in terms of those earlier studies I was talking about that looked at the dust bowl. There was one study that looked at individual level data. The other ones looked at more migration rates. They found, not specifically for the dust bowl, but for the great drought of the 1930s, which partially drove the dust bowl, that it increased the probability of moving in a linear probability model by roughly 2%. Now, that didn't try to instrument it or anything, so even if we compare it to this, you can see it's double, but it's likely much larger. So it really had a large impact in terms of increasing the probability here. I mean, there's lots of robustness checks we tried, so we did different standard errors, allowing for spatial correlation that made the standards error actually smaller, surprisingly. We did, because remember there was county boundary changes over that period. We did more restrictive county boundary changes. The coefficients became slightly lower. You know, we restricted, you know, with this linking, there's always this problem with this census linking. How much you believe it? Yes. Anyway, so it doesn't change too much, which is surprising. Okay, so we also looked at native versus foreign migration, in part because it was more something I was interested in when I read about. And there's a little bit of discussion in that period, because, I mean, first of all, there's the thing that the railroad companies really did get a lot of foreign migrants coming in. Sometimes they would say, we pay for your railroad ticket, right? You can borrow the money from us and slowly pay it back. So you had a lot of migrants coming. Actually, it was predominantly Germans, although there were different enclaves in this regard. But there's a little bit discussion in one paper that I found, didn't look at numbers, that essentially implied that it was the foreign migrants that were much less likely to migrate because they had a very different concept of land, right? Because remember, in Europe there was always shortage of land, and being landless was an important thing. Whereas a lot of the native-borns had a different perception of land, and also a lot of those homesteaders, and that's why I don't really believe the homestead story in general. A lot of them would just come in, you know, essentially go in, you would just have to be first, go register your homestead, pay the fee. Then they would look around for a potential buyer, go with the buyer, renounce the land, and then the buyer could buy it immediately, right? So there was a lot of that turnover going on. And so when you run this regression, you do see that Foreign-born were less likely to move, right? Okay, it's statistically different between these two, of course, with that sample size it is. What's the reason? I don't know. But they are these stories behind it. Okay, so for the, okay, I'll just show you one more bit I won't say too much about this. We looked at these, what are known as these occupational outcomes of migrants. So first of all, I mean, there's two things I should never put up tables like this, but they're essentially, if you look at the migrants, so these are the ones that moved from the affected areas, right? Not necessarily but they're affected, but they just moved from those. I think there's two things you can find from this. First of all, that there's some persistence when they move somewhere else in terms of their the kind of occupation they have, if you put in these broad groups here, but not really very high, right? If they move to non-affected areas, and if you move to affected areas and other locus-affected areas, because sometimes they move to other ones, you have sometimes the persistence similar size, sometimes a bit larger here. So there seems to be changes in occupation, and some of the narrative stories talk about that some people just abandoned their land and went and worked as a laborer in the city, but can't do much of that. Another thing is, and you found the same thing for the Dust Bowl, that actually on average it was much more the laborers who were moving. Because you have to remember, okay, I talk a lot about the farmers in that area, but remember these railroads were building towns in each and every station around it, and there are lots of merchants and other people around there that were dealing with the goods and bringing it in. And it seems a lot of them left, and you do find some narratives that talk about it. But so before I show the agricultural results, we ran a regression. This had to be OLS, where we simply looked at this sort of, you know, these occupational income scores. I'd be fairly skeptical of them because if you know it, it's only in the 1950 census that they started asking about income. Then they used the income and occupation together, create a ranking, and use the median and those sort of things. But Aureli wanted to do it. So we looked at the ones, we essentially tried to look at migrants relative that moved from affected areas relative to other migrants and relative to the ones that stayed, according to county of residence. We divided that up into moving from an affected to an affected county or from an affected to a non-affected county. Right, so this is OLS, no instrumenting. In this regard, and what you find here is that essentially for non-farmers, the occupational income score goes down. For farmers, it goes up. But you might say, well, what's happening with farmers? Remember, these are farmers in 1870, probably went to a city and worked as a laborer. That, according to the 1950 scores, gave them higher income, right? But I mean, one can always ask oneself, why would they have not moved before? Okay, this is not really an individual welfare measure, right? It's just your occupation and maybe your income in the ranking of it. But this kind of fits in a bit with what they find for the Dust Bowl. Okay, so the final thing that I want to talk about is agriculture, because one of the things is, of course, we know that a lot of people probably didn't leave. Did they somehow, you know, adjust the way they were practicing agriculture, right? So most of these settlers that came in had very little experience, right? If any experience. Some of them weren't even farmers, even the ones coming from Europe, just the promise of land. They all, if you look at, depending on the area, some were more oat driven because that was a little bit of a value cash crop, and the others were wheat driven, depending on what area it was. So the question is, what did they do? And remember, as I was saying before, there's some narratives that talk about they diversified, but then it didn't last. Some talk about they just kept on doing what they were doing, and others were abandoned. So we take the agricultural census data here, and we look at a bunch of different county level agricultural outcomes. So this is at the county level. We instrument again with the same sort of instrument here. I won't show you the first stage. Well, it's more or less the same first stage here. And then we look again between 1870 and 1818. I think here in particular, you don't want to look at 1890, because that's when you had all the technological changes coming in, dry farming and barbed fence farming here. And then we put our county level pre-treatment controls. So I'll just show you the graphs of what we did here. So this is the value of all farm level output. So that's just at the county level. You don't find much of a significance. You find the present cash value of the farm goes down. This is the same sort of thing that Hornbeck found for the Dust Bowl counties, that output didn't seem to have fallen in the long run, but the value of farms went down. So perhaps if you want to build a story around it is, you know, the locust invasion happened once. 3 years later, they were back to what they're doing, but maybe there was some uncertainty about whether it would happen again, and that drove the prices down. Of course, in reality, you have a lot more things going on. You know, railways buying up more land, more people settling in, so anything might have affected the land market price. So it's a far stretch to claim that it's some sort of change in risk perception here. Farm productivity didn't change. We don't find any real significant difference in increase of livestock. It increases, but it's certainly not significant. Sample size here is not 7 million, by the way. It's whatever the 500 is. Not surprising because it's before cattle ranching. The number of acres of farmland also didn't change much. Okay, so the second one, then here you find a little bit more. So you find the total number of farms didn't fall. The number of farms, the really small farms didn't fall, but where you really find an effect is in larger farms. And you see it's going from 100 to 500 acres, 509, and 1,000 acres here. Now, of course, this is not surprising because remember, a lot of, if it was homesteaders, a lot of the land that was being bought by homesteaders was 160 acres. You rarely would buy less. Why would you? Because it was the same price here. Even a lot of the railway companies tended to, because they were buying up lands in terms of these predetermined sizes, were trying to sell it at 160 acres, but you could buy more in this regard. So you find a drop here, so that might have been land abandonment here, number of farms, and the very large ones, right? And that may also not be surprising because at the time you would have homesteaders coming in, maybe buying, selling their land, then buying another land and trying to build up large agglomerations here. So that's not surprising. The more thing is crop diversification. So we do find that, surprisingly, that crop diversification actually decreased. So if there was any sort of idea that maybe we should diversify into, they perceive things like corn and other crops, barley to be less susceptible for some reason. There's no real scientific reason why that might be, right? Certainly in the report they don't talk about it. In essence, it did more the opposite, right? The big thing was wheat farm. And some of the narratives talk about that people not only switched back to more wheat, they actually started producing more. You do find oats fell, which was perceived to be perceptible, in particular because that was in Minnesota. Minnesota was supposedly largely affected here. Wheat hasn't changed at all, and corn, which was perceived to be less susceptible, increased. So it kind of fits within the story that people have here. Okay. Oh, the last thing, what I was going to say? No. So let me then conclude a bit. So what do we have here? We have kind of this context, which I think is relatively interesting compared to the Dust Bowl. I think where you had this locust plague, something that if you look at the rural folklore, there's always articles that keep coming up that was very important. I think part of the reason that people haven't looked at it so much because it's this part of it's the same area as the Dust Bowl, and that really became important event in American history. When you look at outward migration, it's relatively high, the impact on it, right? So compared to the only other result we have with individual level data in a period that's a little bit later, well, a good bit later, 50 years later, it's maybe 4 times, maybe double of what it is, depending whether you compare it to OLS here. There's a larger impact on native-born settlers that fits a little bit in with the sort of background story that a lot of them were kind of, you know, a lot of sort of, that were coming within America were kind of there, would buy homestead lands, just try to make a quick buck and then move somewhere else, right? So there was a lot of, there's a paper that actually looks a little bit at migration movements in general and just say people were fairly mobile in this regard, particularly the Americans here, but we don't really know. There's sort of an occupational outcome gain. I wouldn't read too much for those in affected counties. Farmers, I think it's because they probably switched and went to urban cities and just abandoned doing farming here. But loss for non-farmers, they may have moved to other cities and done something that was less remunerable according to the 1950s case here. In agriculture, there's a drop in the value of a farm that fits in with the context. I didn't compare yet whether it was larger or smaller. I think it was relatively close from what I remember. There's less larger farms. I don't think that necessarily meant that they were abandoning economies of scale. I think it was because these federal lands that were being sold were of a certain size, 160 acres, sometimes 80 acres, even when they were privately sold here. Diversification actually went down. So I think people just quickly forgot. And then after a few years, there was no more locust swarms coming here. Perceived less susceptible crops went up. What one in particular? Corn. They don't put that many in here. So I think if you think about adaptation here, so in the face of this context where there's very little government relief, right, where people, settlers had very little experience, where there's very harsh conditions, where most of them were essentially living from year to year because they came in with very little funds from Europe and also from in the US, take advantage of it. Adaptation was multifaceted. Some people migrated away, some migrated to other counties that were affected. some abandoned farming here, and then it just continued. So the last thing I want to do, that we still want to do, major thing, I mean, there's many things we still have to do, is look at homesteading. So, I mean, you do have publicly available homesteading information that you can even download, although it's a little bit harder than what it used to be, where you have the names. I think it'll be impossible to try to link the names, because lots of times what people were also doing is they would claim a homestead land, move somewhere a little bit further away, and then show up with a different name and claim another one, right? There was a lot of selling being to do, but still it'd be interesting to look at how important a lot of people view homesteading, to see if the share of area homesteaded, if that's somehow, you know, if you have higher homesteading land during that period, so that 5-year period that you have, does it have a larger or smaller impact? I'm not sure what the priors would be in that regard, but yeah, so there's still a lot of work to do. So any more questions or comments?
Eric, very much.
Thank you very much for all the comments.